Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Life is a story we tell ourselves, where we share stories that inspire, reveal a truth in the listener, and find the extraordinary in the ordinary. Today's guest is José González. José is the founder of Latino Outdoors. He is an experienced K-12 educator, environmental education advisor, outdoor education instructor and coordinator, and university adjunct instructor. He is also an illustrator and science communicator. Welcome to the program, José.
Here, thank you, Don.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So let's get right to it. What motivated you to found Latino Outdoors?
So in its simplicity, really, it was at its core this idea of, right, how do you connect with others like you? Or how do I find others like me? And unpacking that, what that had meant really is at the time was feeling that there were some of us asking that question, that you have this sense of being the only one, even though, of course, we know it's not the case. There's many people that self-identify with a Latinx identity, in that those cultural components, that anchor and that grounding means something. It's important. And so the question is, how does that connect and relate to the diversity and variety of outdoor experiences? That I like nature. I like going into the outdoors. I like some of these activities. And when I enter those spaces, how much of that do I get to feel like I still get to be myself, rather that you're entering an outdoor culture that's meant to be different and that you're supposed to kind of convert into it. So that was really the core question. And then putting that out there, say, this is what I think, this is what I feel, and then seeing how that resonated with others. And then from there, we connected to kind of grow what would become a platform, a community, and an organization.
Yeah. So what's the overall mission and vision of the organization?
At its core, it is to provide a space for those that have that connection, for whom they say, this is who I am, and this is how I connect to this identity, into this space, and to this desire of being outdoorsy or connecting with nature in all these different ways. And that in doing so, I will be part of a community, contribute to it, and then use that to invite others into it, whether that is through the storytelling, whether that is through the communication, as well as directly through the outdoor experiences by taking families and communities outdoors.
Yeah, I just love what your vision says. I was reading it on your website recently, and it says a world where all Latino communities enjoy nature as a safe, inclusive, and welcoming place. A world where the outdoors is a place to share and celebrate stories, knowledge, and culture while growing leadership, and an active community of Latino outdoor users, mentors, and stewards. That's just absolutely beautiful to me. And I think well stated.
It's our mission and vision.
Yeah. So what kind of things do you do to engage young people, particularly from the inner city, with the natural world?
I would say at its core, how I approach this is by being able to expand what that idea is. Right? I have a colleague, Juan Martinez, who says, the work doesn't end when you take youth out to a national park or youth out to the outdoors. It continues as they return back home, and they get to see the connections between that, so that we also never perpetuate this bifurcation or the separation and difference of what it means to live in a city, in an urban environment, and what it means to, quote unquote, travel to the outdoors. Right? So the more that we are able to do the work that includes being able to notice and engage with nearby nature, right? The nature that could be right in your neighborhood, it could be at a park, it could be at a community garden, and the wildness inherent in that connects to the wildness of these, wilderness designated areas, or these faraway places, so that we can do one of two things. One is ensure that those benefits, those restorative components of nature, we never forget why they're important to have in the city and how to appreciate and connect with them. And it allows us to maintain these connections to places that we may never visit, or that it is not required that we all visit them to um, understand their value and protecting them. So something like the Arctic Refuge, right? We wouldn't want to say, well, we all got to go visit it to understand how important it is.
Right.
We have to be able to understand that that can exist on its own, and I may not have to visit to understand why it's important for me to care about it.
I just love that, the connections. I mean, so often in these programs, you're right. I mean, there's this bifurcation. You go out to the outdoors, then you come back home, and they're separate things, or they're separate things in the minds of people, and that's not the case at all. I mean, I love that concept. That's just beautiful. I mean,
Definitely.
yeah.
And I was going to say, in that it's important that again, it's we move away from these either or types of framing, so that we look at what are the opportunities for both and. Uh, I say that so that we also include this variety of outdoor experiences that a lot of youth also in urban environments may not have. But it gets to the point where it's almost cliche in a very sad and tragic way, that you might have kids that may be 2 miles from the beach and they've never been, right? Because of these access components. And so it's a way to really look at a spectrum of the work that we do, rather than feeling, oh, you're black and brown. I will come in and provide this outdoor experience that will save you. It's not automatically that, right? We don't want to we often say we don't want black and brown to translate to broken. Because really what we really look at, what are the systemic components to ensure that that access is there, and that communities have this range of invitations. Because a lot of times, once that value is understood, communities will connect with it and invest in it. But it's just looking at it different than thinking I have to come in with a savior mentality, rather than what is my role in being an accomplice and an ally in that work, rather than being the savior in it.
So you do have specific programs that recruit young people and bring them to the outdoors to have that experience, and then communicate that need for connection and the kind of overall philosophy that you just communicated.
Yes, the great thing about all of our leaders within Latino Outdoors is that they represent, they are the models of what the message is. And early on, when I was, in that founding role, I would say the great thing is be yourselves. Like the magic of what you're sharing is that you're making obvious to others what's obvious to you, but you've never thought about that who you are. That's the value. It's not about getting you to be something that you're not, because the authenticity of who you are is what connects with others. Whether it's the youth that get to see, like, oh, like that's me, that's who I can be, as well as the parents, that they can envision that. And so with the youth experiences, it's important in two ways. One of them is for especially younger professionals. In many cases, like take Washington D.C., in many cases there it was the opportunity for younger professionals to connect with each other and be able to share in these outdoors experiences, rather than often being like, oh, I am the lone brown participant in a predominantly white experience, but now we get to do it together. And then on another end, especially with even much more younger participants like kids, is that it's embedded in a family experience. And part of that is because there tend to be a lot of, like, let's take kids outdoors type of programs, which are helpful and needed. And sometimes, though, if those are disassociated from the family or from the parent component, the kids might go have an amazing experience, maybe even through like a school program or through a nature bridge experience where they're out for a day or a week. But then they come back to the home, and how can the parents connect and support with that? What if the kid then says, oh, I want to be a park ranger? Right. And if the parents haven't been supported in the conceptual understanding of what that is as a career, they're like, wait, what do you want to do? Or it involves doing what? Rather than, this defaults as doctor, lawyer, or whatnot, which again, important, but it's because we need to expand the cultural conception of what that is. And when the parents go, they're like, got it. Like this is, now this is a family experience beyond just purely on with the youth.
That is so cool, and I'm glad to hear that because it sustains an idea and a concept that actually one of your board members, who of course is a longtime friend and introduced us, Rich Rojas and Dana Beta in California State Parks back in the '90s got started. They started a program called Fam Camp, which was exactly what you just described, and I'm so happy to hear that that's being sustained. I mean, that's one of the most important concepts is involving the parents and the families.
Exactly. And I saw some early footage of what became Fam Camp back, I believe it was like early 90s or late 80s.
Yes.
And so to see some of that footage of families back then learning what it means to set up a tent, like learning this and experiencing, like that's the kind of work that's important for us because you're thinking about the legacy. Richard Rojas loves to talk about this, right? What's your legacy? What's the legacy you're going to leave behind? So to think that we can all contribute to that sort of legacy for what's one that kid that's 9, 10, maybe 12 years old, when they are a park superintendent or when they're a wildlife biologist, to think that you are helping support that kind of future.
Yeah, exactly. So in every program, you have the ideal and you have your mission and your vision and your values, and sometimes immediately you run upon challenges to see that mission and that vision become a reality. What kind of challenges have you faced as you've instituted this program?
That's a great question because the challenges come with the work, right? They often say that you can look at it three C's. What is you are faced with a choice, then or rather you're faced with a challenge, excuse me, and then you make a choice based on that challenge, and then you face the consequences of it. And so I say that because this has come up as a really good question for a lot of other young leaders that have been starting their own projects and their own organizations, right? Or that they're doing this in their own way. And the challenges range from the kind of the cultural constructs, right? Like the big picture thinking about this work, right down to the logistics of organizational management. So what I mean by that is big picture thinking is even just by existing and stating here we are, or we often say in Spanish, estamos aquí estamos, that this matters to us. And one of the early challenges was for our dominant culture to try to even just get that, right? So we would get comments like, wait, Latino Outdoors, well, that's exclusive, right? You are isolating yourselves or you are what does that mean? There's no white outdoors. And so like, got it. Like, see, we need to unpack that a lot more because that kind of conversation is part of the challenge to kind of even just prove why what you're doing is a different approach. So even just helping people understand that component of saying, no, it's not exclusive. It's actually a focused, inclusive approach and conversation for which everyone's invited, but the focal point is starting from a different place than a predominantly white idea of what pure outdoor experiences can be. And it might be difficult for you because you've been embedded in that idea of normative that you don't, you thinking different all of a sudden. It's like, what? It's like, traveling to another country and all of a sudden realizing that, oh, that's, your perception of normal needs to change for you to understand what the culture is telling you is comfortable, familiar, and what lets you know what fits in and what doesn't. And the logistical is just, how do you do this? Like, how do you, when your first cohort of leaders says, we want to take families outdoors, that's very different than saying, let's start an Instagram account and share pictures of each other.
Yes.
It comes with responsibility. It comes with logistics. It comes with risk management, right? It comes with programming. And so those challenges are real because you have to be so aware of what you're trying to represent, because if you don't do that, before you know it, you might take a group of families and have a terrible experiences. You might take a group of participants and remind them why they don't want to do this in the first place, right? And nature is always going to challenge you regardless. This
Yes.
isn't about like making things easy, but there's a difference between saying, let's create a space where we can experience that range compared to let's be irresponsible and then like cause unnecessary harm because of a lack of preparation.
The reason I'm laughing, I remember one of our first fam camp programs years ago when we started out working with community centers. And one of the first things we did was exactly what you're describing. We got people together and asked them what their fears were before they went out to the natural world and let them express those fears. I remember this one kid talking about snakes and how it was just like, if he ran into a snake, he was not going to stay out there in the natural world. But that gave our interpreters, and I think it was actually Dan Abeda, the opportunity to then do an interpretive program about the kind of snakes in California, and that most of them that they would run into were not poisonous, and how to react if you did run into a snake. And so it gave an educational opportunity as well, but it was really interesting.
Yeah, well, that question of fears, right? It's a really good example of what we mean about like having this cultural awareness and approach, because in many cases, there's obviously perceived and real fears. Real fears and safety concerns you have to account for because you want people to understand that if you go out there and there are certain types of snakes, that it's okay. But if you're unaware of it, you can make a mistake and then it kind of proves your point, right? I knew it. It was going to bite me. And I was like, well, we didn't go over risk management to understand what it means to be out here in that context. But the perceived fears is important because it's that opportunity to listen, right? To be able to understand and show them that you care rather than being dismissive about it. Because there are many cases people ask, well, what about the bears? And now we could say, well, that's just silly, right? There's no bears here. There haven't been bears for 50 years. Or like, you're just like saying, you almost make them feel like dumb for thinking that would be a real thing. And one of the ways we've approached it, where it's like, well, tell us more about it, right? Like, where did you hear this? Or what is it about bears that scare you? And that's a way that you begin to unpack it. So that you're supporting them in understanding that context, but also you're not being outright dismissive of it and reminding them like, oh, this is the way you don't fit in. And also with humor, as you noted, with some youth, for example, and this is before Latino Outdoors when I was doing outdoor education. We had a group of, these were primarily Latino kids sleeping outside under the stars for the first time. And so it was kind of like their first overnight experience. And of course, the magic is all there, the stars, right? The night sky, listening to sounds that you have not heard before, seeing the sky in such a different way. But of course, one of the kids would ask, well, what about El Cucuy? And so if you're not familiar with El Cucuy, that's like what, I don't want to say the boogeyman, but it's this cultural element of like what parents might tell kids, I want you to behave or be careful because then this boogeyman's going to get you at night. So kids were saying that, and I could easily have been like, oh, come on, that's silly, or like whatever, like your parents would tell you this and it's not important. The cuckoo is not real or it doesn't exist out here. But rather we said, well, let's think about this. How do we prepare to be safe in the outdoors, and what are the kind of risk management we've gone over? And they would talk about it. Said, well, I have a new one specifically for El Cucuy, which is we're going to have some Cucuy detecting stones around the whole setup. And we're going to test that. And I'm pretty sure that no Cucuy will get through here, and you'll see in the morning. And of course, half of them kind of got in on the joke and were laughing about it. But even just that comfort level of kind of saying, let's do something about it, was a really great experience to be able to say that.
Oh, that's absolutely awesome. Well, let's make this a little personal. What about you in terms of your experience with the natural world? Can you recall your first experience, or maybe a unique experience you had that changed your life, or that was transcendent, or had you coming away looking at the world differently than when you went in?
Yeah, as you notice, you mentioning kind of this idea of the extraordinary. And so for me, so kind of the natural world, uh, I've been fortunate to approach it with like as many lenses as possible. And what I mean by that is not just recreational, but from a natural science perspective, a cultural lens, spiritual elements, so that it's always offering so much. And that part of the journey to get here was I was born in Mexico, so I'm an immigrant from Mexico, relatively rural small town in the state of Nayarit. And so nature or the outdoors, what's outside, you can just go out and all of a sudden you're out in the foothills, in the monte, in el cerro. And it wasn't until coming to the US that this idea of traveling to the outdoors, that's like we're all going to get in a car and then go to a river park or go someplace where the outdoors was. And so that helped me kind of think about that. When we were mentoring with youth living in the cities. And so two moments that stood out early on from that experience was I believe it was sixth grade. We went on a school trip to Calaveras Big Trees, so state park, for sequoias. And I remember seeing those sequoias for the first time was this very magical experience of like, how does something like this exist?
Exactly.
Right. So the first visual impact, the first experiential impact was there. And that only built up over the years with coastal redwoods as well, for me to just start thinking about the scope and scale of these giants, right? And everything from connecting them to the magical realism of Latin American literature to the perspective of if they could share a story with me, what would that even be like, right? What would they teach me? What would they offer me in terms of like thinking at that scale, right down to the science of it, to say, wow, talk about the adaptability and evolution to these ecosystems, what allows them to be here, to, how amazing they are at carbon sequestration. So it's like just that kind of expansive an invitation. And so that's one that definitely got me early on.
Yeah. Oh, that's just absolutely beautiful, that connection of the spiritual with the scientific. And that all brings about a grander understanding. It makes the sum greater than the parts. It's what I call emergent. There's something that emerges that you never saw before until you have the experience. You put it all together, and then you say, like you just articulated, wow, how can this be? And that's
right.
One of those mystical experiences that often happens in nature, and it's really important, I think, in life in general.
Yeah, and the great thing about how that connecting to now is I'm trying to be a lot more intentional about looking at how nature provides some of these frames of thinking, right? Some of these ways to not engage with life, obviously, but also just look at this idea of reconnection. So for all our, technological wonders and whatnot of where we are now, we also, going back to this bifurcation and separation, that we've separated ourselves from nature in many different ways. And so you talked about emergent, and one of the things for me is to look at this idea of life logic that comes from nature. So how do I think about things as examples? Because take that, if a team is working really well, you might say it's a well-oiled machine, right? You start thinking about the language and the way that we think about performance or being as these separate elements from nature, and say, well, what if you thought about a team as a well-tended garden, right? Or what if you thought about a team as a stewarded sequoia grove? Like what pushes you to think differently than that, beyond just being like a piece of machinery? And so I share this because this idea, when you mentioned emergence, I thought about the river and how flowing like a river for me has been a metaphor of thinking about moving, because a river is, once you channelize a river, you destroy it in so many ways, and we know this, right?
Yes.
But the flow, this idea that emergence comes from the divergence, right? From engaging with difference, that would pushes you, it takes you right away a little bit. But then the convergence, how it comes back to the common, to the together. So between divergence and convergence, you get the emergence of that flow. And so that's been a powerful reminder for me when I go out in nature and say, okay, what are some things, in addition to the beauty, to the recreational benefits, to the health benefits and whatnot, what are what are some learnings and teachings that are still there that I kind of need to connect back with?
Well, I think that's deeply profound, even in a scientific sense. If you study emergence, even in physics, that notion that you just articulated about emergence or divergence and then convergence and coming together, you can find many times, even on the very, very deep layers of particle physics and quantum mechanics. It's just a beautiful concept. See that you can glean from those experiences that you have with nature. So just tell me a little bit, you mentioned health a little bit and well-being during this period of isolation because of the pandemic. How important is it for people to get outside and experience the natural world?
Well, it's critical. And to use the term that we've become a lot more acquainted with, essential. So it's essential. And I say this because, well, nature has always been essential. We, as humans, two among many, but two kind of core components is that we evolved, right? We came to be who we are in relation to each other. We are social creatures. We weren't really designed to be in isolation. And in fact, we know that when we are in prolonged isolation, we suffer. Everything from we've evolved to pay attention to each other, to like look for little cues, what's letting us know that we're good or not good, right? To this idea of family, of community, and different scales of that. So that's one thing. And then the other one is that we evolved, we grew, we came to be in relation to the natural environment as part of it for sure, but also just as paying attention to what the natural environment shaped us and how these ideals of wellness, they're connected to that. So I say that because through urbanization, we made this very deliberate effort to have nature be different and separate, rather. And without paying attention to when we built our cities, what did we lose? And what we notice is that if we don't pay attention to the design aspects, for example, that we create environments that bring out more of the worst of ourselves rather than best of ourselves. So how we create porches, rooms, all of this matters. And we become a lot more aware of it. So going out at nature is, in many ways, like going back to not just go to the hospital, but to go back to that source of wellness. We know we feel better. We know we do better. A lot of the research now shows that we don't just get the physical benefits, but also a lot of the cognitive benefits, stress reduction, you name it. Nature, of course, is a great place for reflection. And even now in pandemic times, which has magnified and amplified a lot of our social inequities, right? We get kind of reminded us, this is what, this is how broken things are. Nature is a great place to go out and reconnect with all of that, as well as literally having the space in which you can social distance better. The air quality is better, not counting fire season that as we're going right through right now. But it's those elements. So when we pave that over, when we destroy that, we lose it. And even when we try to recreate it, it's not the same. It's not the same. So I think the more that we can protect nature for nature's sake, it's also for ourselves, while also ensuring that nature gets to do the thing that it does best. That level of the complexity, that level of brilliance, that level of emergence that we don't have to duplicate, yet we get to benefit from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's beautiful. and a great place to leave it. I thank you, Jose, for joining us on Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. And the stories I think you've communicated to us will redound to the benefit of all of our listeners. And we really appreciate what you're doing out there. Thank you, Jose.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. To find out more about the podcast, you can go to our website at lifeisastorypodcast.com. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave a comment or hit the like button. Stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.